So my name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books. Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're delighted to welcome editor Ben Wilkins in conversation with Kym Smith to discuss Anne Braden Speaks, Selected Writings and Speeches, 1960 to 2006. Finally, and for the first time, we have full access to a representative collection of Braden's writings, speeches, and letters in the full spectrum of their subject matter, from the relationship between race and capitalism, to the role of the South in American society, to the function of anti-communism. So Ben Wilkins is a labor organizer based out of Durham, North Carolina. Currently, he is the director of Raise Up the South, a union of low-wage service workers with chapters in Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. We have some Raise Up folks in the house, perhaps. He is, of course, the editor of the book we are celebrating tonight. And he's going to be in conversation with Kym Smith, who is a mom to a revolutionary artist and scientist, a popular educator, organizer, cultural worker, Southern scholar, Trekkie, and up-and-coming theologian. Kym was born and raised in West Columbia, South Carolina. Kym loves proving academics wrong and redefining what is and who is an intellectual and what's considered theory, and making sure everyone remembers that South Carolina is the blueprint for real class struggle and real revolution. Okay. Welcome to you both, and I want to let folks know whether you're watching at home or watching here live with us, you can ask questions towards the end. So for folks watching at home, just put them in the chat, and I will give voice to them on our now working microphone. And for folks in the house, I will bring the microphone to you. So we just want to make sure that everybody can hear each other. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to Kym and Ben. Thank y'all so much for being here. Woo!
Nice. Okay, so mic is working. Nice. Well, first I just wanted to say thank you, Ben, for editing this book, and just thank you for being in conversation with me about this book. It's a definite honor. It's just really, really honored and humbled to just be here with you today. And so I'm just gonna jump right in. So my first question, and the really first thing I really wanted to ask you is, why Anne Braden? Like, why did you choose to study Anne Braden, put these collections together? Like, what drew you to Anne Braden?
Well, I'll start, I guess, with the personal first, and then maybe just talk about why I think Anne Braden's work is so significant. I first learned about Anne Braden when I'm 40 years old now. I learned about Anne Braden when I was probably 20 years old. I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, kind of in a movement family. My dad was active in supporting Black power struggles, the civil rights movement, et cetera. And when I was really young and trying to figure out kind of what I was going to do with my life, how I was going to express my kind of politics, he introduced me to somebody by the name of Leonard Zeskind, who was a researcher on white nationalism and was a movement activist in the South in the 60s and 70s, and worked really closely with Anne Braden. And he would always, talk about Anne Braden. A lot of my kind of political formation in those kind of early years was honestly just sitting in his living room and listening to him tell stories about his work in the past, which I think is actually the same kind of popular education method that Anne Braden actually used. And for whatever reason, just when he talked about her specifically, it was always incredibly fascinating. And there wasn't like a ton of resources that you could find in those days. This is like, around the year 2000, not like a very substantial internet. I don't think that Catherine Fossil's biography had come out by then. So I was always just kind of curious and did whatever I could to learn about her work, learned about the Southern Conference Education Fund through doing research and reading about Anne Braden, and just always kind of thought that this is somebody who contributed, I think, more than people realize and has been undervalued in the kind of movement lexicon when we talk about the history of the movement. And what I think is significant about Anne Braden's work is really a few things. First, and I think most widely understood, is her analysis of race, what she called the centrality of race to every aspect of American society and world society. And then second, the way that she specifically had an analysis of race that tied race and class and race to the functioning of capitalism. So she wasn't analyzing race in a vacuum, which I think, oftentimes happens. And what she would have said is that's not the right way to think and talk about race. And then I just think her practice in the movement, the way that she operated, the ideas that she had are really instructive and have a lot to teach to today's generation. So, I think she's like many movement veterans, movement historical figures that get sanitized historically. We've seen it with Rosa Parks, we've seen it with Dr. King, everybody. And with her, the story that gets told, despite a lot of really good scholarly work that's been done about her, and there's, I would advise people to read, Catherine Fossil's biography. It's so good. But the popular kind of, I think, story is here's this middle-class white woman who overcame her personal racism and, did the right thing, sided with the civil rights movement, took a righteous stand. And that's true. But that's like a very surface level understanding of Anne Braden. And so I just wanted to really unveil the kind of fullness of her legacy, and then also let her speak, as the title says, hear from her what she thought, how she analyzed society, so that people could really get a clear understanding of the way that her and the movement she emerged from really thought about these really pressing issues.
Amazing. Yeah, and I think that's so important. And one thing, it was so much in your response. I'm like, okay, I want to hit like so many things.
Yeah.
But I think one of the first things I want to pull out of that is her analysis and her methodology. Because I think a lot of times, especially with women, they think, it's broad. It's just like, oh, she did a good thing. She's taking care of everybody. And they completely forget about our analysis. They completely forget that we're scholars and we're theoreticians. And that's who Anne was.
Yeah.
She was, and so can you kind of talk about her education methods and her methodology and just her analysis of, the South?
Yeah, that's such a good point. And I think it's true, as you said, of women in the movement broadly. One funny thing about Anne Braden that I learned from doing this research is she was in a partnership with her husband, Carl Braden, for many, many years. And the way that people kind of tell the story of their working relationship is like in and of itself patriarchal. So there's this kind of like common assumption that, he was older than her, he was a movement activist before she was, that's true. But there's this assumption that he kind of took her under his wing, taught her how to be an organizer, taught her about the movement. And that's actually not true. I learned that from talking to people who knew her and him, including their son. And there's actually like a bunch of stuff she did to really radicalize him, especially on race, and on, what it would really mean to build a socialist movement in the South. And she was an incredibly dynamic thinker. I mean, at a really young age, she was reading Freud, Marx, these kind of big thinkers. And she's a Southern white woman. You're not supposed to do that if you're a woman in the South. She's supposed to be a Southern belle. She's supposed to, be matriculating into this life of, marrying rich or whatever it is that people are supposed to do back then. And so she was a really deep thinker, and she engaged with really deep ideas. Anybody who was a part of the kind of collective, that they really formed around themselves will tell stories about the bookshelves in their house. They had this living room and they would just have young people come hang out, talk about books. And she was deeply studied in history. She really, I think, centered the importance of popular education in movement building. So actually, I want to read a quote really quick from the book where she talks about the importance of education. She says, this is on page 250. She says, organizers come from struggle, but they rarely develop for the long pull without some kind of process through which they can learn more than what comes just from the experience of the last campaign. There must be a setting to reflect on the experience, and with the complex nature of the problems we face, there must be a setting in which they can gain essential knowledge about the nature of the institutions they are contending with. And so I just think that's really exemplary of her approach. And, you said earlier you like to prove academics wrong. She was exactly that too. She didn't, there's been this separation in the movement. I think she would have agreed with this between the kind of academic world and the activist world. And those of us in the activist world aren't supposed to think about the big picture. We're not supposed to have a societal analysis. We're just supposed to knock doors and fight and try to win whatever game we can. But she wanted to break down that wall, and she was all about breaking down every kind of false wall that was built by the power structure in that moment.
And I think that's so important, just, you know, and that's what I got from reading, especially the section on popular education. It is, especially here in the South, you know, we're just supposed to protest and do this and do that. We're not supposed to be thinkers. We're just supposed to be fighters. And Anne so beautifully showed that you got to have a balance. You got to know how to be both. And you got to develop tactics and strategy. And it's so much more to the Southern freedom movement than just the KKK and burning crosses. It's a whole intellectual movement. And she really proved that. And like her writing really speaks to that, which I'm so glad that like you put that popular education essay in there. And another thing, just thinking about, you know, women in the movement, and you mentioned how people always thought that she, you know, she was brought up by her husband, and her husband was a thinker and he just taught her. And it reminded me of, you know, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta. You know, if you study Coretta was pushing on these international politics. Coretta was the one who was like, no, we can't just talk about America. We got to talk about abroad. You know, Coretta really pushed and changed and shaped his politics as well. And I really want to talk about the letter to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, because I was dying laughing when I read this letter, because I was like, she a whole scammer. She know exactly what to say and how to get him to really see and use his, like her faith.
Yes.
You know, because she was a Christian woman,
Yeah.
and understand that I need to speak to him through our faith to get the point across. That's how he understands it. So can you just speak more about it?
Yeah. I mean, she was very. She had an ability to persuade people and to like know how to persuade folks. And I mean, there's two kind of stories I've heard just from talking to folks who worked with her. One is that, you know, going back to her and Carl, he was kind of a little bit of a jerk from what I've heard and was like real hardcore. She was like the nice one. She would kind of come and talk to you. She would develop really close relationships with folks. She was really good at understanding people. And she did that especially in the student movement. You know, folks understand the importance of Ella Baker, or they should if they don't, in the student movement, but she was really a team with Ella Baker. And, you know, Ella was working with a lot of the Black students. Anne Braden was working with a lot of the young white students. And I think just really had a deep understanding of how to speak to people. She talks about the importance of faith in the Southern movement. I think sometimes people perceive that as, oh, we need to have pastors with us on the picket line. And of course we do, that's good, but that's not really what she meant. She understood the deeply rooted culture of the South. And so when she was talking to Dr. King, she was specifically talking to him about anti-communism. And she didn't write a letter that was some like ideological polemic about anti-communism. She spoke to him in Christian terms. And she said, you know, there was you, Dr. King, and she's talking to a really famous person by this point. I can't remember if he had won his Nobel Prize by that point, but it's 1960, like he's international celebrity, this really well-respected, you know, in the power elite, has won this kind of fame. And she says, like, you have to be unafraid of being unrespectable. And these attacks on communists, whatever you think about the Communist Party, communist politics, whatever, that's not even the question here. The question is, are you going to let this power structure define the terms of the debate and the terms of the movement that we're building? And you have to be unafraid of being unrespectable. And then she says, there was never a more unrespectable person than Jesus Christ. And quotes the gospel. And she was raised religious in the Episcopal Church and always kind of maintained that faith and really deeply understood. And she was a scammer. She was able to hustle people, but it was always authentic. It always came from a very authentic place. And she had a deep understanding of, you know, a person like Dr. King and how to talk to him. And I think she really modeled how to be persuasive, which I think is an important skill for people to have.
Definitely. And her also just her perception, like the power of perception and discernment that she had, that she could tell that like this is how I need to relate to him on this level. And I also want to just point out that she wasn't just a Christian woman, she was a theologian. She understood the exegetical methods that were needed to talk to him. She understood scripture on a level and did a deep analysis and knew what this scripture meant and knew how to talk to him about it because Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a theologian.
Yeah.
So it's so much more deeper, and that's what I love about Anne Braden is so many layers.
Yes.
Layers there.
Yeah.
And so I want to really talk about, this is a Southern white woman. Like you said, she was supposed to be a Southern belle. She was supposed to be a daughter of the Confederate, right? She wasn't supposed to go to Grimke sister route.
Right.
She was supposed to go to the Daughters of the Confederacy, but she didn't. And she also, there's a letter in your book where she talked to Southern white women and really wanted to talk about, like, what is our role in this movement? It's not just to be out here pro-we, it's got to be deeper. So can you just talk more about that letter and just kind of like, what was she really trying to say to Southern white women and just white people in general?
Yeah. Well, she was writing that letter, I think 1972 was the year that letter was written, the letter to white Southern women. It was specifically about a black man, Thomas Wansley, who was being tried and was going to be executed for raping a white woman, which is fairly certain was a false charge. And she basically writes this letter to white women. I think the timing of the letter is really important. It's at the kind of explosion of the feminist movement in the late 60s, early 70s. And there was a critique that a lot of folks made that a lot of people in this room will understand a lot more deeply than I have, that really it was trending towards, there was an element of feminism that was becoming like a very white feminism and was not making the connection between race, class, capitalism, and patriarchy. And I think she really had a keen understanding of her political development as a person, as a woman, a white woman in the South. And the first thing that she experienced personally was patriarchy. Like, she's supposed to become a Southern belle. She's not supposed to have become a journalist, which is what her career was. She wasn't supposed to be a writer. She wasn't supposed to read all these deep books. And so that was an oppression that she faced personally. But she was able to not just stop there and use that personal experience to build an entire analysis. And I think she was recruited into that analysis by people like William Patterson and Paul Robeson. And I think she had an understanding that although there were many limitations of the, what many people called like the white women's movement at that point, this is a key struggle that needs to be developed. And what she was arguing is that white Southern women have to have a deeper understanding of race specifically and the role that it plays in upholding the entire system of patriarchy really in the South.
Yes.
Yeah.
Everybody in cyber, everybody watching, to read this book and learn about Anne Braden, because there's just so much in here. Just really so glad that you put this together, Ben, and just made it accessible. And so another thing that really stood out, I sent you a quote earlier, but she was really about organizing white people in the South.
Yeah.
She really talked about, you have talked about the importance of that multinational unity and the importance of, it can't just be this struggle, that struggle. It has to be a multinational struggle. We can't be afraid to organize poor whites in the South. So can you kind of just speak to, one, her viewpoints on that, and also yours, and how you feel about just them organizing poor whites and just organizing the South in general, that multinational unity?
Yeah, well, first of all, your first question, why Anne Braden, why did I get interested? And I really buried the lead. I think like a lot of it was because I'm white, and it was just curiosity about like how did this white person become this incredibly powerful anti-racist movement leader. And so I think she had so many things to say about the function of race, the consciousness of white people, the role of white America in kind of maintaining the system. But I'll just point out one, I think really, really important one, was her analysis of not just the fact that we need to pull white people into struggle against racism, but specifically that there's this dormant power base in the South of poor whites who are a natural ally with the Black movement. And she actually had many conversations with Kwame Ture specifically about this exact question. And so folks, know the book Black Power by Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton. And, one of the things about that book that I think is really misunderstood is there's a line in the book that says the only acceptable coalition for the Black Power movement is with poor white people. that is where there's a unity of interests. And if poor white people can get organized, that is who we want to build an alliance with. And she really deeply understood that. Poor whites are the folks who have nothing to lose but their chains. Like, she understood that. She said at many points in the book and every speech writing she gave that, you know, the one thing that could destroy the power structure in the South is an alliance. And she's talking about, you know, back in those days of Black people and poor whites specifically. And therefore, the ruling class has done everything they can to destroy the possibility of that alliance. Mm-hmm. And so she did a ton of work through the Southern Conference Education Fund and the other organizations she was a part of to pull white people in, you know, in the 50s and 60s, specifically to the integration with the desegregation movement. And she was really self-reflective about it, and I think self-critical in some ways, by saying, you know, what we did in the 50s and 60s was organize a lot of middle-class white people, and that was important work. It was good work to support what was then called the integration movement. But the real threat to the power structure is if we can build a mass movement of poor whites standing side by side with this Black-led freedom movement. And so that was the work that she really devoted herself to for the greater part of her life. They launched, you know, the Southern Mountain Project in, I think, Kentucky, organizing, you know, really poor Appalachian white people. They did the Grow Project, Get Rid of Wallace / grassroots organizing work in Mississippi, and in Alabama organized, you know, the Gulf Coast Pulpwood Association. I think that was in Mississippi too. And these were all projects that were specifically aimed at pulling poor working class white people into struggle. And, you know, we've had a lot of experience with that in the work that we do, you know, across the South with the Union and other movements. And I think one interesting thing about this, I think, is really not understood enough, is I actually think not only is that coalition between poor whites and Black-led movements the thing that could overturn the system, but poor white people, my opinion, and I think she would probably share this, are actually more open to revolutionary radical ideas than the middle-class white folks. Like, I think that's absolutely true. And it is not the way that it gets talked about. I mean, you see so many analyses of Trump voters being poor white people, et cetera. And of course, there are many, many working class white people who have racist ideas, who, you know, vote for racist candidates. But I think at the end of the day, there's millions of people in the South, white people, who are working at Waffle House, just like there's Black people working at Waffle House. Mm-hmm. And we're struggling with housing, just like Black folks and Latino folks are struggling with housing. So I think that is the kind of material basis for the kind of coalition that could really fundamentally transform the South, and transform the country.
Amazing. And just, you know, just continuing on that, just thinking about the time period that Anne Braden was organizing, where we are today, right? And we know there's still that potential for that, you know, for that unity, and you kind of giving your point on it. But where do you think, or, you know, what, I want to phrase this, but like, what do you think it's going to take for us to just come together? Because, you know, we still have those contradictions and those struggles. And of course, you know, the ruling class, this is their favorite game, is pitting, you know, poor whites and Black people against each other and making sure races stay divided. So kind of, you know, what do you think, not just I want you to theorize about like the future, but just like, you know, what are some steps? Like, what do you think people should be doing, or things we should put at the forefront as we try to build these coalitions, like practical things?
Yeah, I think it's three things that I would point to, and most of this is in the book. One, there's a really good piece called Black Power and White Organizing, where she's arguing against a kind of growing trend of saying, we're going to organize white people separately, and they're going to get organized, and then they're going to be a part of this freedom movement. And she was saying, you cannot do that. You have to, at every step of the way, build multiracial movement when you're talking about organizing white folks with Black folks, with brown folks. Number two, I think that overcoming racism has to be done through struggle. It's not like a purely intellectual exercise, it's through the struggle. And I think in the course of the struggle, you can't sidestep race. At no point can you sidestep race. You have to attack it head on. Every conversation specifically with white workers has to be about the need to build multiracial unity. You can't just say, oh, hey, you make low wages. Do you think we should raise the wage? Do you think you should have a union in your job? Do you think you should have housing? You have to have an analysis. And that's the third point I want to make, is that it's not just about the day-to-day struggles. It's about having a broader analysis of the way that race functions and doing popular education in a mass way with poor white folks to really drive that point forward, so that people start changing their ideas. And I've seen that. I'm sure like a lot of folks in this room have seen that. When people go through struggle, they change their ideas. And I think fundamentally that's what she was about.
Yes. And just, you mentioned, again, our favorite topic to talk about, Ben, is, pedagogy and education.
I
And
thought you were gonna say white people.
second favorite topic to talk about. My second favorite topic to talk about is white people. What y'all need to do is how can we work together? But I think one thing I really want you to define popular education, because I think sometimes people really get confused on what popular education is, right? And it's a method. It's actually it's a real skill set and a method, and it's something that you're actually trying to do is educate populace. It's not something you do. So can you kind of define what it is and how Anne Braden did it, just kind of clear, and maybe what is, you got the new Union of Southern Service Workers, what are some methods that y'all do with that multinational union?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot I could say. I mean, I would point to, she worked really closely with the Highlander Folk School, Highlander Center, Myles Horton. And I think that kind of pedagogical method that came out of the Southern struggle, I think is really important to understand. I think one of the most basic concepts that she held, that Myles Horton held, that many others held, was the education has to start from the experiences of the people who are in struggle. So it's not just about imposing ideas from the outside. It's about people analyzing their experiences, their life, the conditions they face, the struggles they're in, and building an analysis out of that. And that's not to say that it's a totally spontaneous thing that happens. There's a role for leadership. There's a role for having an analysis, a conscious set of ideas, and teaching people. She was a teacher, and I believe, and I think she believed in the role of teaching folks. But it has to start with people's experience. And then one thing she was really strong on also was just the importance of understanding history. I think this gets back to that kind of false wall between, intellectual work and activist work. And there's a lot of times I hear, I've actually been laughed out of rooms saying we need to understand history. We need to have an analysis of history. But I think it's really important. And she would have said that it was critically important too. And so she was always talking about the example of Reconstruction, South Carolina, like you talked about, where, as you know, it was freed slaves who were composing most of the legislature, but also a lot of poor white people that were trying to build this new society in South Carolina. So pointing to those historical examples, because that's where our current reality really comes from, and not being afraid to express ideas with working class people. Workers actually love ideas and love talking about history. You just can't do it in a dry way. It has to come from their experiences and relate to the lives that people lead.
Yeah, 100%, exactly. You got us on our other favorite topic, Reconstruction.
Yeah.
That's the next book talk we're going to talk about Black Reconstruction.
Yeah.
Our favorite book, but and just really with that learning and bringing that historical materialism to, because history shapes our the reason we're here today. It's the reason why we're here. It's the reason our conditions are the way they are. And so how Anne, what was her view of history? I know in the book she does talk about Reconstruction.
Yeah.
So what was her viewpoint of that period in time and how it kind of shaped the period that she was in, that 60s era?
Yeah.
What was her analysis on that?
Let me answer that question, but you just reminded me of something I didn't say earlier, which is that it's not only that political education or popular education should come from people's experiences, but every person has a philosophy. Mm-hmm. Every human being has a philosophy of life. It's just inherent to the way that we are as humans. And she was really, I think, deeply understanding of honoring the value systems, the ideological systems that people have created out of their experiences. And so that's where that kind of faith thing came in the South. So I just wanted to note that because I don't want to forget it. But then in terms of Reconstruction, yeah, I think she honestly, and she would have said this, like she took her analysis of Reconstruction from Du Bois, who was corresponded with her when she was facing sedition charges, when she was on trial with her husband. You know, Du Bois was helping and trying to be an ally and helping with their case. Was going to come down at one point, but then decided like this is actually going to be too much of a distraction. But they wrote back and forth. She was in that kind of milieu of left activists in the 1940s and 50s. And, you know, the analysis of Reconstruction was that, you know, I won't quote this exactly because I'll get it wrong, but Du Bois said the slaves stood for a moment in the sun and then returned back towards slavery, right? So you had this moment between the 1860s and 1870s where it really did look like a real democracy was going to emerge in the South. You had former slaves leading the movement. You had abolitionists from the North coming down, helping, doing literacy campaigns. You know, folks who understand revolutionary history know about, you know, the Cuban literacy campaigns and all these kind of revolutionary examples. One of the most impressive, I think, incredible mass literacy campaigns took place in the South after the Civil War. And it was key to this movement of former slaves and some poor whites. And so you had this moment of possibility, which takes place at the very same moment that, you know, this new kind of imperialist structure across the world is growing. And so it was a real lost moment. But I think what she would say and what Du Bois would say is that you can look to that moment, the movements that people built, the forms of organization that people built, the constitutions that people passed at the state level, like the South Carolina State Constitution, North Carolina State Constitution, really like radical documents that talk about the fruits of our labor. Like that's in the Constitution. We need to enjoy the fruits of our labor. And folks, for whatever reason, don't think of abolitionism as a labor movement, but it like very obviously was a workers' movement. It was a movement to liberate workers. And the Reconstruction era, I think, is just really critically important to understand. And then the way that it was crushed, the abandonment of Southern workers by Northern labor and by the Union, and then what came after it was destroyed. Because if you just think about the time period, when did the United States begin westward expansion in a big way? When did the U.S. start colonizing the Philippines and Latin America? It was after the defeat of Reconstruction. And so the moment is just really full of, I think, historical importance. And the essay, Southern Freedom Movement Perspective, which is like the biggest part of the book, really delves deeply into that. And she had a really good analysis of it.
And just calling it, I think, just also point out that we're calling it the Southern Freedom Movement because people don't see those periods like abolition of slavery and Reconstruction and civil rights as like it was a movement for freedom. It was a movement for democratic rights. It was a movement for humanity. It was a Southern Freedom Movement. And I've been lucky enough to hear you teach about the Southern Freedom Movement. Like very lucky. If y'all have never heard him teach about the Southern Freedom Movement, like it's amazing. And I really want, just going back to that essay, because it is the biggest essay it is the biggest letter in the book, so I know it's like probably one of the ones you studied the hardest. Yeah. So just what are some takeaways that Anne Braden, like what are some of her biggest, analysis of the Southern Freedom Movement? And then what are some stuff you want people to take away and understand about the Southern Freedom Movement and just kind of those two?
Yeah. Well, I think the thing that was most impressive about her analysis of the Southern Freedom Movement was her framing it against the backdrop of the long history going back to slavery, colonialism, Reconstruction, but also placing it in a world context. And I think you cannot understand the civil rights movement and that period in the South in the 50s and 60s without understanding the world situation. And number one, the United States emerges out of World War II with unrivaled power. The productive forces in this country were strong. There had been this war economy that had been built. Europe had been totally decimated, which had been the previous kind of imperialist powers. The Soviet Union had done all this work to destroy Nazism, and was totally depleted, like millions of its citizens had died. And so I think understanding the American century, as it became called, and her comrade Jack Odell was really clear on this, who was another important figure in the Southern Freedom Movement. But the moment after World War II, the status of Jim Crow in the South is really critically important on a global stage. So in 1955, you have the Montgomery bus boycott. Everybody knows that. Most of us know that anyways. Also in 1955, you have the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, when all of these third world nations came together to think about together, how do we create an independent path forward? There's this contest between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the power structure in the US is like, we have got to figure out how to put an end to this trend towards national liberation. And a key weakness is Jim Crow in the South. And so they had to figure out a way to manage the obvious problem of racism in the South. And so you saw a kind of twofold response. On the one hand, the power structure was forced, because of the Black movement, to concede some key demands: the right to vote, desegregation of public accommodations, etc. But then, on the other hand, they did everything in their power, and she talks about this really eloquently, to prevent any motion towards economic redistribution or these alliances being made with these national liberation struggles and the struggle in the South. And so a big part of that was anti-communism. And so people like her, people like Du Bois, people like Paul Robeson, people like Esther Cooper Jackson were brutally repressed. And you have very few organizations. There was a really vibrant left movement in the 30s and 40s in the South. The Southern Negro Youth Congress, the Communist Party was really active, the CIO movement, all these incredible unions, like the union that she was radicalized through, the farm equipment workers in Louisville, these left-led unions that were about more than just wages and working conditions. All of that had to be smashed. So you have this unstoppable movement emerging, but at the same time, the left that could have provided some kind of connection and deeper analysis was really heavily repressed. And despite that, a really powerful movement was built, and people asked really big questions and wanted to push things beyond kind of limited demands. But there was a real effort to destroy that. And she described it as a fence was built around the movement. So you can question segregation, you can demand the right to vote, but what you can't do is you can't question capitalism. And for her and for a lot of people, that was like the big next step. So she's writing that essay in 1965. And again, to think about the timeline, you have the March on Washington in 63, you have the Civil Rights Act, I might get these mixed up, the Civil Rights Act in 64, the Voting Rights Act in 65, these huge victories. And so the question that she asked, she ends the essay by, asking what she called unanswered questions. So we've got everything we've asked for. We've won all of our demands. Maybe we're just not demanding enough. Maybe we need to demand a more far-reaching change to the structure of the society and start asking questions about the basic structure of the society. And that was the struggle, I think, in the civil rights movement that I don't think is all that well understood. But that was what she and a lot of her comrades were pushing for. And so in this letter to Dr. King, in 1960, she's constantly agitating, saying we have to go deeper, we have to go further.
Yeah, and it just reminds me of Dr. King's, book, Where You Go From Here, Community or Chaos. He was, it shows that was a period where they were still grappling. Even after the wins, they were still grappling like it's more, something deeper, and not being broad, always having that deeper analysis. And one thing that, just speaking of this, deep analysis of the Southern Freedom Movement and just not having a broad idea of race, I really want you to speak to how important it was to Anne Braden that people didn't just have a broad idea of the Black liberation struggle. Because I think when people think there's a struggle for Black liberation, they think of, the police killings. They think of very specific things, right? They don't really think of it as a struggle for self-determination and, social upliftment and these really deeper things that impact us internally. So I really want to know just how did she view, or how did she educate people not to have a broad, idea of the Black liberation struggle, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Let me see if I can answer that question. I mean, I think the first thing she did, I don't know if this will be a direct answer to your question, but I think there's an important kind of example that illustrates her approach to the Black liberation struggle. So there was a moment in the mid 60s when there was this push towards Black power inside of SNCC and in the Southern movement, led by Kwame Ture, who was then Stokely Carmichael. And across the kind of mainstream civil rights movement, there was kind of like a real fear of what Black power meant. But SCEF, the organization that she led with her husband, which is a predominantly white organization, fully embraced the call for Black power and understood that analysis of building a Black power movement that had a strong component of poor white folks who were supporting the core demands of the Black power movement. So I think she just had a very textured understanding of race in the South, and the critical importance of the independent validity of the Black struggle, but also understanding that didn't cut out working class whites from joining that struggle. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think her approach towards Black liberation is incredibly unique in that period among kind of folks who looked like her and even a lot of the Black civil rights leaders.
No, thank you. That didn't answer it. That gave me some answer. It gave me more questions to ask you later. So
appreciate your honesty.
So I think we're going to give other people time to ask questions, audience members, people in the chat, which I think is going to be fun. Maybe they can trip you up. I didn't do a good job. So
I'm sure somebody will.
Yes, we'll start with folks here in the live audience.
Hi, my name is Pamela Owens, and I guess I'm probably one of the oldest people here. And I'm real excited about this book because I worked with Carl and Anne.
Oh, cool.
And I can tell you for sure there was no patriarchy. And would not have allowed it. It's like, no. I did experience the living room with the literally to the ceiling, to the floor books. And their daughter Beth was about 12 or so then, 14. And some years later was back there after I was married and we had some kids. And I noticed something I hadn't noticed the first time. Anne had way too much to do in her life to dust things. And I took that to heart, but I've never dusted since. In the
book, she has a quote about how she doesn't clean her house.
There were many ways in which Anne and Carl were role models to me, but that's one of them. I was a living organizer in the South, at first in Vanderbilt in the late 60s, and then that was in Nashville, Tennessee, and then in Charlotte. And Carl trained me as an organizer to be the staff organizer for the North Carolina Political Prisoners Committee. And old communists from New Orleans, Jim Dombrowski, New York, and was had out and raised the money from some people up there. And that I wrote for the Southern Patriot, and I had pulled out as we were getting ready. We've just been here 2 weeks, not even 2 weeks, in Stone Mountain. I came across and pulled out by packing a file folder of things related to Anne and SCEF, and somehow can't find it now that we're here. But one letter that I had from her that I wondered if you have seen, it was very personal, was a letter that she sent to all their friends and colleagues announcing Carl's death. Such a beautiful, I hadn't read it in years, but I did not experience Carl as a jerk. And just as an example,
I meant jerk as a compliment.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe in that way, it's a compliment. One of the last things actually he did before he died, it turned out, was send us this is my favorite, sent us a congratulations card on the birth of our daughter in January 75, and had a $5 bill in it, which was more money than 75, with the words, "Buy her some toys," with an exclamation point. I got 2 toys. But what I learned from them was it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work. This is not something that you just play with or say the things about. You are on the ground. I was on before databases. It was the file cards.
Yeah.
You know, you had your file cards and you sorted them out according to where you were headed and found the people in there. And Carl did most of the traveling.
Yes.
And Anne, I mean, Beth was little, so one of them had to be home. And he was the traveler, which is part of how he died so young, because he got several varicose veins and such.
Yeah.
But she pretty much ran SCAF from, you know, from their base in Louisville and edited the Southern Patriot. Yeah. And traveling around writing for that, just saw so much and so many places that the blacks and the poor whites, you know, were working together. And then after the October League took over SCAF, one of the things Anne did was start an organization called Operation Freedom that funded, one of the things she did was fund organizers. And she funded me in the summer of 76, after the Supreme Court gave us as our bicentennial present the return of the death penalty. And so she funded me to start bringing back to life the Texas Coalition Against the Death Penalty.
Yeah.
I couldn't have done that without her. And, you know, I got a lot of people on the board because I learned from them. You know, just go ask anybody.
Yeah.
All they can do is turn it down. You know, so I got the head of the Texas Conference of Churches, you know, because I asked him and I went with the assumption they would do it, you know, and I learned that from them. You just assume that people are going to do the right thing. If they don't, they don't.
Yeah.
But if you didn't ask them, they probably wouldn't. Yeah. Anyway, I want to be here because I want to meet the kind of people who'd be here. Yeah. I don't know anyone except my husband, who has always been a radical, but I brought him along to be more radical. And my daughter, who is radical everything, and her husband and our 10-year-old grandson, who we're sharing a multi-family house with. I don't know anybody else. So, you know, you're the kind of people I'd like to be friends with. If you know any my age, you know, that'd be
Well,
great.
thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you.
Thanks for letting me.
Yeah.
I'm hoping this question will trip you up.
Okay.
Come on, no. I'm gentle. So can you talk about the importance of Anne Braden's work as a journalist, and the importance of journalism to organizing work? And I have a second part.
Okay.
Or a third part.
Okay.
And the repression she experienced due to anti-communism in her work.
Yeah, so on the journalism question, I didn't talk about that enough. She was really a journalist by trade, like that was her trade. She was radicalized actually as a journalist. She, her first job in journalism was with a newspaper in either Birmingham or Anniston, but she tells this story about, you know, covering the court and just kind of seeing that daily injustice of the Jim Crow system. And one of her most significant pieces of work was editing the Southern Patriot newspaper, which, you know, I think if you understand the way that revolutionary movements have used journalism, it was really in that model. It wasn't just transmitting information, it was an organizing tool. And so it was an incredibly good paper. It was well written. It looked really good. it provided news about the Southern Freedom Movement, but it also transmitted ideas in a really big way and gave a forum for local movement activists who nobody knew anything about to be a part of something bigger. And so a lot of what she would do would just be to interview somebody who was doing a voter registration drive in middle of nowhere, Mississippi, you know, or talk to a political prisoner who was serving time, you know, behind bars, and using that as a way to build a movement and to build organization, really, is what she was doing. And so, you know, she saw journalism as an act of, as a political project, not just recording what's happening, but how do you intervene in the movement. So I hope that answered your question on that one.
Perfect.
Yeah. And then the other one was repression, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So she and Carl were charged with sedition 3 times, which I'm not an academic historian. I don't know of anybody else that was charged with sedition 3 times.
Okay.
That's like a lot of times to be charged with sedition. So the first time was in 1954. You know, this is at the height of McCarthyism. They had a couple friend, like a family friend, the Wades, black couple, who like legitimately just wanted to find a house. And in Louisville, it was a segregated city, and they couldn't, he was an electrician, so he made decent money. He couldn't find a big enough house in the segregated black neighborhoods. So he came to Carl Braden, who he had met through the Progressive Party, very important historical formation, and said like, hey, if I give you this money, will you buy this house under your name and let me move into it? And they were like, yeah, of course. And just by doing that, and then the kind of cascading series of events, it led to this sedition case, where, you know, their radical politics were put on trial. You know, a Christmas card from William Patterson was like used as evidence. William Patterson was a Communist Party leader. So that was the first time. The second time was, I think it was in the early 60s. You might correct me if I'm wrong about this, when Carl refused to testify to HUAC. And then the third time was in Kentucky, when, you know, some of the sketch staffers were organizing poor white folks, and that was seditious activity. So they were charged with sedition. And they were able to, what I think is interesting about that is, first of all, it just takes a tremendous amount of courage to obviously kind of struggle through that. One thing she said, though, was the sedition trial actually, in a way, it kind of, what's that phrase, like, you know, you burn the I don't know warfare phrases or whatever, like you burn the bridge so you can't cross over or whatever, like
You can't go back.
yeah, you can't go back.
Yeah, you burn those bridges.
Yeah, it made it impossible for her to like go back into official society, and she kind of had no choice but to be a revolutionary at that point. But I think the second thing that's really interesting is the way that they fought repression. So I think this is really instructive for us today. You know, there was three basic things that people did in those days. One, if you got tainted with the charge of communism. One is you became a snitch. She was never going to do that. Two is, you know, somewhat more understandable, but a lot of people would just say like, no, I'm not a communist. Like, I'm just fighting for democracy or whatever. Really trying to distance yourself from left-wing radical movements. And the analysis that she and Carl had was that even if that's true, even if you're not actually a communist, because a lot of people weren't communists that were being, you know, put up on trial, it doesn't work, and it actually just allows the state to repress you even further. So what they did, which was really innovative at the time, was go on the offensive and make this about the First Amendment, makes it about the freedom of speech, and put the system on trial. And they used journalism to do that. They used organizing to do that. So I just think the way that they fought repression is really, really instructive. They didn't back down, and not only did they not back down, they kind of, you know, jujitsu'd it and used the system against itself, and used it to build their movement. Like, that's when she met Ella Baker, was when she was campaigning around Carl's clemency. So like that was how she kind of built this initial network that became what SCEF was in the 60s.
And they refused to ever answer the question,
Right.
are you a communist?
Right. Yeah.
They refused to Even their friends.
Because you box yourself in one way or the other. If you deny it, then you're just ceding ground. And if you say, yes, I'm a communist, this was her analysis, like you're making it about that. And really, that shouldn't be like the litmus test for whether you can be politically active in this society. But she was a Marxist.
Can we talk about it? Can we say it again that like her analysis for interpreting the world was a Marxist analysis and she utilized Marxist methodology? Can we remember that? Can we?
Carl's parents were Marxists, and they tried to name their first son Marx. Episcopal priest said, "I baptize you in the name of Jesus," whatever. Mark. Carl, they tried to get by it, and then Carl with a K.
Yeah.
And so the priest said, "I baptize you, Carl, C-A-R-L."
I didn't know that's what
Carl loves Shuttlesworth.
And let me actually, if I can, because you were talking about Carl, I actually think he's a really important figure. He was not a writer and died early, so he's not well understood, but she said a really beautiful thing. I've never read that letter, but she had a speech about it.
If you want a copy, I'll be glad to get it.
I would love to see that, yeah. She said, and I think this is a lesson for all of us, she said, "I don't believe Carl ever won any particular honor. He was never given an award that I know of. He never had a place in anybody's establishment, not even of what we call the movement. He never wanted those things, never sought them, and he didn't have them." Like, he was a man who did not care about clout, like at all. He was just in the struggle, and I think that's really important for all of us. It's a very like bourgeois thing to care about
Exactly.
your individual clout. He was just leading a life of struggle, no matter who knew about him, cared about him, and was totally willing to be completely unrespectable. And I think that's really important for all of us to embody.
One honor, sort of, that they got, but I mean, is there used to be something they used to Liz that was it's like a African American history Olympics or something like that, where kids from different schools would come together and answer questions. And one of the questions was name 5 white people who were key in the civil rights movement. And of course, the people who were killed in Alabama, but Carl and Anne are at the top of the list.
Absolutely.
Anybody else before we close out? Our folks watching at home are being quiet, which is totally fine. So, anybody else got any more comments?
Yeah. So one thing I noticed in kind of the work that Raise Up is doing is that like understanding of the history of the South and the Southern Freedom Movement. Like in the opening video at the Raise Up conference, they have they open with this understanding of the common thread between where Black and oppressed workers are right now in the service industry, which is the largest industry, and that link between slavery, going on to Reconstruction, and how this is actually a common thread. This isn't just like about slavery then, but we're here now, and stuff like that. And I think that's really important. I really like that Raise Up utilizes that framework. I'm wondering, is it something that was kind of brought over from like Anne Braden's understanding of Reconstruction, going up to the time she was organizing, and I guess the main question is like what what kind of popular education was Anne Braden doing that's similar to the work that Raise Up is doing, is also being done in other movement spaces today to educate people about our history as oppressed people and workers.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in terms of the way that we in the union kind of analyze Southern labor and the history of Black and oppressed workers in the South, it totally comes from not really just Anne Braden, to be totally honest. I think it's a whole tradition of analysis. Going back to Du Bois, William Patterson, there was a really textured analysis of the role of Southern labor in the political economy of the United States. And you know, Du Bois was really clear on this. Like he said, the thing that disempowered the working class the most in the history of this country was the separation of the Northern trade union movement and this incredible movement of Southern workers during Reconstruction. And that has continued to this day. And the status of Southern workers has been very unique and very important to understand. Obviously, it goes back to slavery, but in the 1930s, entire classes of workers were excluded from basic labor protections, and that exclusion continues to today. And so you see lower wages in the South, you see less unions in the South. So yeah, I mean, just to answer the question, like absolutely, the way that, you know, we kind of think and talk about it, Anne Braden's a key, not, I wouldn't say the only person, but like a really key person in the way that we think about it. And then in terms of the way that she did popular education and how it relates to today, one thing that, you know, she spent a lot of time on was building education programs with union members. There was a lot of her work in the 1940s with the farm equipment workers. And, you know, these kind of mass organizations that were uniting Black and white workers around these basic struggles, using those as forums for popular education. And she continued to do that in the 1980s. She was supporting poultry worker organizing, catfish worker organizing. So I think utilizing the trade union movement as schools for workers was something that she was really, I think, clear about, and that the movement that she came out of was really clear about. So I hope that makes sense, but yeah, that's a good question.
Hi. I like how you talked about, I guess, how like Anne was basically kind of, I guess, tugging at like Dr. King, like after they kind of, you know, you got your vote, you got your Civil Rights, then you got your Voting Rights Act, and it's just like, okay, yeah, like, well, where do we go from here? Like, there's more, we got to keep going for more. I guess because I love the book by Dr. King, Where Do We Go From Here, Castle Community, one of my favorite books ever. So like, did she kind of talk about like how what was his response to that when she was kind of tugging him, like there's got to be more, or you know, what else can we do, and we got to go deeper? Like, what was King's like response to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a really interesting story. He, you know, he was kind of like wishy-washy about it at first, but that letter that she wrote, and then just the work that she did building a relationship with him, I think really was influential on him. And he actually was really solid, really from then on, about, you know, not backing down, being in struggle with even people who were tainted with this claim of communism. And, you know, she said like she had a deep appreciation for him. He wasn't just to her, he wasn't just this popular leader that she was trying to get on the podium so people would come to the rally or whatever. Like, I think people do that sometimes with big popular leaders. I think she had an appreciation for his radicalism. And that's what he was working to build. She was a key organizer for the Poor People's Campaign in 1968, which is what got Dr. King killed, obviously.
Right.
And really was, if you read the 1965 piece, you basically see a call being made for what became the Poor People's Campaign. And then there's all these documents in the archive of these meetings in Appalachia of people like C.T. Vivian, another important figure, Myles Horton, the Bradens, Don West, Jim Dombrowski, who are trying to figure out how do we deepen this struggle. And that, I think, thrust really is what becomes the Poor People's Campaign. And so, no, I think she was both a teacher for him and influential for him. You know, she was older than him, so I think she kind of played a mentorship role in a way, but also was influenced by him, and really, I think, understood and appreciated his deep intellect and his radicalism.
Yeah, I think it's pretty great. I always want to know like who were his influential figures, his pieces that kind of just pushed him more and wanted to go more. And he I think one of his one from the Southern Christian Leaders Conference asked him, well, like, what are you gonna do with this Poor People's Campaign? And King said, He said, no, they said, well, what about the white people or the Indian people? King said, well, are they poor?
Yeah.
They said, yeah, bring them on.
I think that's actually a great place to wrap it up. We're at time, so thank y'all both so much. I really appreciate it. Appreciate all of y'all here with us in the room and all of our friends watching at home. I'm going to encourage folks who are watching at home who want to buy Anne Braden Speaks. Click this teal button at the bottom center of your screen. You can do that now. If you want to support the work of Charis Circle, our nonprofit, you can do that by clicking the donate button, which just popped up. We really appreciate donations of any size to support us in our work. We're going to say goodnight to our folks watching at home. Thank you so much.